The Fallen! You are amusing, in a what the hell is wrong with you kind of way. If a tree falls in the forest, I'll kill the bastard what done it. You couldn't have made a better choice.
Greetings, mortals. It is I, Remortis. And today I'm coming at you with another build guide to Baldur's Gate 3. This time for a build inspired by Jaheira herself. A dual-wielding druid that can deal some solid damage in melee, but still being a potent spellcaster. While working on some other dual-wield builds, I came across this one and wanted to share it with all of you. Taking much inspiration from her original roots from Baldur's Gate 2, I decided to make her a fighter druid. But let's get more into that, shall we? So when I had Jaheira join my party, I was curious on what to do with her, especially with her fondness to wield her two blades, one of which actually caught my eye, the Sylvan Blade, which lets her use her wisdom modifier in place of strength or dexterity. And don't get me wrong, the Sylvan Blade is just decent. It's not amazing by any stretch, but it's pretty neat nonetheless. Her other blade is just a +1 scimitar, whatever. But druids as early as level 3 can get the spell Flame Blade, which conjures a fire sword that also uses their wisdom to attack. And in Baldur's Gate 2, as I mentioned before, Jaheira was already a fighter druid multiclass. So put 2 and 2 together and here we are. A fighter druid in Baldur's Gate 3. And it actually works quite well. So for the levels, it's really just 5 levels of fighter. For 2 weapon fighting, action surge, a subclass, a feat or ASI, and extra attack. The subclass choices here would be between champion for simplicity and for an endgame crit fishing build, or battlemaster, which is what I prefer for its versatility and utility. In particular, disarming and pushing attack and riposte. Although menacing and trip attack can have its place as well. And of course, you can't forget about precision, although dual wielding usually doesn't have an issue to hit since it's not using great weapon fighting or sharpshooter feats that penalize your hit chance. And as for druid, we want to at least get to level 3 to access that flame blade. And to get a subclass. And for dual wielding, Spore Druid is actually pretty amazing if you can sustain your symbiotic entity, which adds 1d6 necrotic damage to all of your weapon attacks. This works for ranged weapons too, by the way, so keep that in mind. So ultimately, this build will allow you to use a few items to stack some damage on your melee hits, such as the Callous Glow Ring and the Caustic Ring, which adds 2 radiant and 2 acid damage respectively. You'll also be dealing an additional 1d6 necrotic damage from your Spore Druid passive, and an additional 1d6 if you're utilizing Hunter's Mark, and the Concentration Ring that deals 1d4 psychic damage on top of that, in place of one of the other elemental rings, but we'll get into that later. Let's go back to the build a little bit. So there are a few ways to accomplish this build. You can stick to her roots by being a 5 fighter and 7 Spore Druid, so we can still cast at least one 4th level spell, most likely Woodland Being, or you could go Ranger 5 and Spore 7 for even more spell slots and Hunter's Mark, which can output some solid damage. Or you can go the more min-maxy version of Ranger 5, Spore 5, and 2 in Fighter, so you can still get that action surge. And keep in mind, with Hunter's Mark, it'll always increase whatever damage type that it hit with, including the fire damage from your Flame Blade. As for which Ranger to play, it doesn't really matter too much, so play whichever one you would like. They all kind of do considerable damage. The Hunter and Beastmaster will probably result in more consistent damage, but Gloomstalker's improved initiative is always nice to have. And of course its initial ambush attack is pretty sweet too. Although speaking of Beastmaster, I'll be making a dual-wielding Beastmaster Drisset build in the near future. Alright, now on to the items that make this build work, and some insight on other dual-wielding builds too. You can get this build online in Act 2 the moment you're able to recruit Jaheira to your party. Or you could have Halsin run this build until you get her. Or, you know, have it on another character. Anyways, look out for the strange conduit ring found still on the finger of a Githyanki Inquisitor. This will let you deal an extra 1d4 psychic damage to your weapon attacks while concentrating on the spell. This is a great ring for clerics and druids, which have pretty strong concentration spells, but it's also really great for rangers using Hunter's Mark or even warlocks using Hex for even more additive damage. Another ring to look out for is the Caustic Ring, which adds 2 acid damage to all of your weapon attacks. Simple and satisfying. You can find this one from the Underdark, from Dareth Bonecloak, the dwarf at the Myconid village. And this will last you until you get a hold of the Cowless Glow Ring near the end of Act 2, but you'll have access to this ring by the time you get to Jaheira, which will deal radiant damage and also do a slight debuff to your enemies. An interesting weapon that can be found in Act 2 is often missed, and it also fits this dual wield concentration style type play, is known as the Thornblade. It's a +1 scimitar that deals an additional 1d4 poison damage while you're concentrating on a spell. This is sold by Damon at Last Light, and it can be replenished and restocked, so you can actually dual wield these if you check his stock enough as you rest throughout the chapter. Although these are probably better used by rangers, since they will be using your dexterity hit instead of your wisdom, like the Sylvan Blade or your Flame Blade. And speaking of Damon, be sure to bring him 3 pieces of Infernal Metal, or 4 if you've been hanging out with Karlach, so you can acquire your own beautiful pair of Flawed Helldust gloves, which will add an additional 1d4 necrotic damage to your attacks. And well, if Damon isn't around, fear not, as you can find a pair of Dark Justiciar gloves that also provide a 1d4 necrotic damage to attacks as well, in a dark temple, near a stinky demon. And at Moonrise Towers, you can find this sweet circlet sold by a rather creepy drow alchemist, the Circlet of Hunting, which lets you get a bonus 1d4 to hit while attacking marked targets from Hunter's Mark and a few other spells. And in Act 3, there's a slew of other great items to acquire. I won't go over all of them because that's half the fun in Act 3, is finding these new items. But there are a few you can grab fairly early in the act, such as the armor of the Spore Keeper that adds extra necrotic damage to your attacks when your symbiotic entity is active, in addition to some other neat Spore effects that should have honestly been baseline to the Spore Druid class, but oh well. And of course, you should make sure to swing by Jaheira's own home to acquire Belm, a pretty sweet scimitar that actually was in Baldur's Gate 2, although it's a little bit different here. And it'll give you a few interesting attacks with your scimitar, including a whirlwind attack. Of course, the ultimate form for this build, and in any dual wielding build for that matter, would be all of the crit fishing gear, which is mostly tied to a rather bloody questline. Just follow the murder trail and eventually you'll find most of these pieces. And in total in the game, I believe there are about at least 5 or 6 items that will reduce your number to crit, but honestly we'll be going over the crit fishing build in another guide as well. So anyways, this build is pretty fun and fairly solid. It can perform pretty decently on most boss fights, but some of the more challenging boss fights it will lag behind. But that's not necessarily a fault of its own, but just how nutty some of these encounters can be. And it can be a bit clunky setting up your symbiotic entity before a fight, since it consumes a whole action, but if you can manage to keep it up, it'll result in some solid damage. But anyhow, I hope you enjoyed this guide, and kind of get you some inspiration on how you might want to play Jaheira. If you enjoyed this guide, please like, comment, and subscribe for more. I have a few other character build ideas in my head rattling around, particularly a Shadowheart build that embraces Shar. And it isn't a cleric build, it's more of a rogue monk ranger hybrid thing? Question mark? Anyways, thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Farewell for now.